Okay, so picture this. You want to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but there's this huge landmass in the way. What do you do?
Well, you could sail all the way around South America, or you could try something a little more ambitious, like carving a path right through it.
And it's exactly what happened with the Panama Canal. But this isn't just some cool engineering feat we're talking about.
Yeah.
This thing is steeped in history. It's got international intrigue, big money power plays.
Yeah. And even some present-day drama with the U.S. and China thrown in for good measure.
Exactly. You sent in a YouTube video that really caught our eye from the Wall Street Journal called Breaking Down Trump's Plan to Take Back the Panama Canal.
Ooh, yeah, that's a juicy one.
Right.
Yeah, it really dives into this whole controversy.
So in this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack all of that. We're going to go back and look at how the U.S. got so involved in the Panama Canal in the first place. We're going to break down exactly what Trump is claiming and then try to figure out what all this means for the future. And not just for the U.S., but for everyone, really.
Yeah, because this thing's a major player in global trade and politics even today.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock. Take us back. How did the U.S. even get into the Panama Canal business to begin with?
All right, so imagine it's the early 1900s. The U.S. is a rising power, and they see the potential of this canal. It's a shortcut, basically. They figure if they can get ships moving quickly between the Atlantic and the Pacific, it'll shave thousands of miles off shipping routes and give their economy a big boost.
Makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So they decide to go for it. But it's not easy. It's a massive undertaking. I mean, we're talking $375 million at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, which translates to something like over $11 billion in today's money.
That's a lot of dough.
It is. But they get it done. They carve out this 50-mile waterway. And on top of that, they also secure control of a 10-mile wide strip of land running alongside the canal, which they called the Canal Zone.
So basically, they carved out their own little slice of Panama. I'm guessing that didn't exactly make everyone happy.
You're catching on. A lot of folks in Latin America saw this as the U.S. throwing its weight around, classic imperialism, a powerful nation coming in and basically taking what it wants.
Yeah, that's never a good look.
It created a ton of resentment. I mean, think about it. A foreign power controlling a crucial waterway right in your backyard. Not exactly a recipe for friendly relations.
Right. So all this tension simmers for decades.
Yeah.
And eventually gets to a point where even the U.S. realizes this whole situation is kind of a powder keg.
Exactly. Even the U.S. started to see that holding onto the canal in such a hostile environment was a risky move. And that's where the 1977 Torrijos-Carter Treaty comes into play. President Carter makes this really controversial decision to hand over control of the canal to Panama.
Hold on. Controversial. Why would a U.S. president just give up something as valuable as the Panama Canal?
Well, think about it. Imagine you're trying to run a business, but everybody's protesting outside constantly. There are threats of sabotage. It just becomes really difficult to operate in that environment.
Makes sense.
Plus, Carter genuinely believed that improving relations with Latin America was worth it. He figured a friendly Panama running the canal was way better than a hostile one potentially disrupting it. It was a long-term strategy for peace and stability in the region.
Okay, so fast forward a few decades, and we get to the era of Donald Trump, and things get a little heated again. The video you shared highlights Trump's claim that Panama is violating the 1977 treaty, and he wants to take it back.
Yeah, that definitely grabbed people's attention.
He even said, and I quote, "We built it, we're the ones that use it. We're going to take it back."
Yeah.
And well, that obviously stirred up a lot of controversy. So what's he basing this claim on? What are his arguments?
So Trump's argument really centers around China and the fact that China has been increasing its influence in Panama in recent years. He points to Chinese investment in the region, especially in the ports at each end of the canal. And those were initially operated by a company called C.K. Hutchison, which is based in Hong Kong.
And he sees that as a problem.
He views it as a threat to U.S. interests and potentially even national security. Basically, he thinks Panama is getting too cozy with China and that it's undermining the spirit of the treaty.
So he's saying Panama's playing favorites with China, and that violates the treaty. It's kind of mind-blowing how something built over a century ago is still causing all this drama on the world stage.
It really is. And it raises some big questions. I mean, how much influence does China actually have over the Panama Canal? It's not like they own it, right?
Right. Panama keeps insisting that they are in full control of the canal. But there's no denying that China's been making some serious inroads in the region. They've secured significant contracts. I mean, they even built a bridge over the canal.
Oh, yeah, that bridge caused quite a stir.
I bet. I mean, the video mentions an expert who pointed out that although the bridge itself doesn't give China control of the canal, it could potentially be used to block it, like if it were sabotaged. And then there are concerns about the bridge being used for espionage. Like maybe they've embedded sensors or scanners in the structure to spy on ships passing through.
Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller.
Right. And then there's John Feely, the former U.S. ambassador to Panama. He served under both Obama and briefly under Trump. He warned that China might try to use its commercial activities in Panama as a cover for espionage and intellectual property theft.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to the situation.
Yeah. But it's interesting because the video also mentions that Feely was critical of Trump's approach to the issue. He called it bellicose language.
Yeah.
So it seems like even within the U.S. government, there are different opinions on how to deal with China's growing influence in the region.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely a range of views on this.
For sure. And we can't forget to consider China's perspective. They've denied any involvement in espionage and emphasized that they respect Panama's sovereignty. So we've got accusations and denials and this whole geopolitical chess match going on. So we've got this tension building between the U.S. and China with the Panama Canal right at the center. And it's clear that the U.S. is not exactly thrilled with China's growing influence in the region. But have they actually done anything about it beyond just talking tough? Are there real actions being taken?
Oh, they've definitely moved beyond just words. Remember those ports at each end of the canal that we were talking about, the ones operated by Hutchison? Well, a group of investors led by the American company BlackRock, they went ahead and bought a majority stake in those ports.
So basically, they're now under American ownership. That's a pretty big shift. What else has the U.S. been doing to kind of push back against China's influence?
They've been applying pressure in other ways, too. So Senator Marco Rubio, he's been pretty vocal about his concerns regarding China. He actually visited Panama, and after his visit, Panama decided not to renew its agreement with China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Interesting. So Rubio went down there and basically convinced them to back out of a deal with China?
Yeah, pretty much. And Rubio was obviously happy about it. He even went on social media to praise the decision and called it a great step forward for U.S.-Panama relations.
Okay, so we're seeing the U.S. using both economic and diplomatic muscle to try to counter China's influence in the region. But let's get to the heart of the matter here. Can the U.S. legally just take back the Panama Canal like Trump suggested?
Well, that's where things get a little murky. The 1977 treaty, it doesn't actually give the U.S. any legal basis to reclaim control just because they think Panama might be violating it. It's not like they can just rip up a contract because they're not happy with how the other party is doing business.
So what options would the U.S. realistically have if they were really determined to regain control of the canal?
Well, one option would be to try to negotiate with Panama to buy it back. But that's a long shot.
Yeah, I can't imagine Panama would be very eager to sell.
Right. For Panamanians, the canal is a symbol of their national pride and their sovereignty. It would be like asking someone to sell their family heirloom. It's just not going to happen.
The video we watched even quoted an expert saying that for Panamanians, the canal is their essential nationalistic touchstone, and that not a single Panamanian would support selling it or trading it back. So yeah, that sounds like a dead end. What about the military option? Trump did mention the possibility of using troops, although he kind of downplayed it.
It's true, he did bring it up, but even suggesting the possibility of military intervention is a very risky move. I mean, think about it. That would be a major escalation, and it would seriously damage the U.S.'s reputation on the world stage. Plus, it would probably spark a lot of anger and instability in the region.
Yeah, so you're talking about potential armed conflict, international condemnation, a complete breakdown of relations with Panama. It seems like the costs would far outweigh any potential benefits, even if the U.S. somehow managed to pull it off.
Exactly. Most experts agree that it would be a complete disaster.
Okay, so let's say the U.S. decides to take the more sensible route and they rule out a military takeover. What other options do they have for dealing with their concerns about China's influence? Are they just stuck playing a waiting game?
Not necessarily. There are a number of proactive steps the U.S. could take. We've already seen some of them in action, things like diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, strengthening ties with Panama. Those are all viable alternatives to a hostile takeover.
We've talked about BlackRock buying those ports and Panama backing out of the Belt and Road Initiative. But are there other things the U.S. could do to counter China's influence without resorting to those kind of strong-arm tactics?
Absolutely. It's kind of like this. If you want to be the preferred partner, you got to offer something worthwhile.
Right.
The U.S. could significantly increase its own investments in Panama and the surrounding region. Think about infrastructure projects, economic development programs, security cooperation initiatives. It's about showing Panama that they have more to gain by aligning with the U.S. than with China.
So it's about building relationships, building trust, and proving that the U.S. is a reliable partner.
Exactly. It's a long-term strategy, but it can be very effective. It's what people often refer to as soft power.
Soft power. I like that. So it's the power of persuasion rather than the power of force.
Mhm.
But what about those concerns over espionage? China has been accused of using its economic activities as a cover for intelligence gathering. I'm guessing that's not something the U.S. can just ignore.
You're absolutely right, and that's where things like intelligence sharing and cybersecurity cooperation come in. The U.S. can work closely with Panama and other regional partners to keep an eye on Chinese activities and try to mitigate any potential threats. This might involve sharing intelligence reports, providing training and equipment coordinating responses to cyber attacks.
So it's about working together to protect shared interests, rather than trying to go it alone. It definitely seems like a more sensible and effective approach. But even if the U.S. successfully counters China's influence, it seems like this whole situation has brought to light some broader issues about the future of the Panama Canal and its role in global trade and security.
Yeah, you're hitting on something really important here. The Panama Canal, it's not just waterway, it's a crucial piece of global infrastructure. It impacts everyone. And as we move further into the 21st century, its importance is only going to grow.
That's a great point. So what are the larger implications of all this? What does the future hold for the Panama Canal, and what role will the U.S. play in it?
It's a really big question, and it goes way beyond just this one canal. Think of the Panama Canal like it's a major artery for global commerce, Like a huge amount of stuff passes through it every year. We're talking about something like 6% of all global maritime trade.
6%?
Mm.
I had no idea it was that much. What kind of stuff were we talking about?
Oh, everything. I mean, cars, electronics, grain oil, you name it. It's all moving through the Panama Canal.
Wow. It really makes you realize how much we rely on these shipping routes.
Yeah, and that's why any kind of disruption to the canal, whether it's political instability or a natural disaster or even, deliberate sabotage, it would have a ripple effect throughout the entire global economy.
That's a little unsettling. What kind of ripple effect?
Well, we could see supply chain disruptions, price hikes, even shortages of essential goods.
So it really drives home the point that we live in a very interconnected world. Like what happens on the other side of the planet can directly affect us here at home.
It's true, and that interconnectedness is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allows for more trade and economic growth, which benefits everyone in theory. But on the other hand, it also makes us more vulnerable to disruptions in far-off places.
And the Panama Canal is a perfect example of that vulnerability. Like, it's a choke point where even a small problem could have huge consequences for the rest of the world.
Exactly. It's a strategic location where a relatively minor disruption could have massive global implications, and that's what makes it such a focal point for these geopolitical rivalries.
Which brings us back to the whole U.S.-China thing. We've talked about China's investments in the region, but I'm curious about the bigger picture. What are their goals here? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, China's been very strategic about expanding its global influence. They've got these big initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically this massive infrastructure project that aims to connect Asia with Europe, Africa, Latin America.
I've heard of that, the new Silk Road or something like that, right?
Exactly. And the Panama Canal is a key part of that plan. It gives them easier access to the eastern coast of the Americas, and it helps them strengthen ties with countries in a region that the U.S. has traditionally seen as its own backyard.
So for the U.S., it's not just about the canal itself. It's about China challenging their dominance in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah. It's about influence and power in a rapidly changing world.
So how should the U.S. respond to all of this? We've already talked about why trying to take back the canal would be a bad idea. But what would a more sensible approach look like?
Well, instead of confrontation, I think the U.S. needs to focus on long-term strategic engagement. Things like diplomacy, economic partnerships, security cooperation.
Could you give me some specific examples? Like, what would that actually look like?
Sure. First of all, continuing to strengthen ties with Panama and other countries in the region is crucial. It's about building trust, showing that the U.S. is a reliable partner, and then offering attractive alternatives to Chinese investments, things like infrastructure projects, economic development programs. It's about showing Panama that they have more to gain by working with the U.S.
So it's not about trying to shut China out completely. It's about presenting a better option.
Exactly. And it also means working together to address those security concerns we were talking about earlier, things like the potential for espionage or sabotage, sharing intelligence, providing training and equipment, coordinating responses to threats, that kind of stuff.
It's more of a collaborative approach to that, recognizing that these are complex global issues that can't be solved by any one country acting alone.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It seems like the Panama Canal is going to continue to be a hotbed of geopolitical activity for years to come. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the biggest takeaway you want our listeners to think about?
Well, I think the big question is, what role will the U.S. play in all of this? They can choose to approach this like a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Like they have to beat China at all costs. Or they can choose to work with Panama and other countries to ensure the canal remains secure and operational for everyone's benefit.
So the future of the Panama Canal and the role the U.S. plays in it is still being written.
That's a great way to put it.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Panama Canal. I have a feeling our listeners are going to be thinking about this for a while.